The fortress moon of Caldraxis hung in the black sky like a scarred fist. And somewhere deep inside its military academy, Commander Vitha Sen was running out of options. She sat behind her desk with her clawed hands pressed flat against the surface, and the holographic reports floating in front of her told a story she did not want to read again. 11 instructors injured, 3 currently in medical tanks, 1 psychologist who had resigned through a written letter because she refused to return to the building in person, and a repair bill for the barracks wing that made Sen's stomach turn. All of this damage had been caused by children. 6 Drash cubs, ages roughly equivalent to human 10 through 13, had been sent to the Galactic Union Joint Military Academy as a diplomatic gesture from the Drash hegemony, and the gesture was rapidly turning into a disaster that could restart a border war. The Drash were apex predators from one of the most dangerous death worlds in the cataloged galaxy, and even their young were terrifying. 8-limbed creatures covered in dark iridescent scales, with venomous spines running down their backs, and tails that ended in edges sharp enough to cut through standard armor plating. And even the smallest of the 6 cubs was faster than any adult soldier Sen had on her staff. The largest cub was called Rikash, and he was already 5 feet tall and still growing, and every handler who had entered the barracks had learned his name the hard way. Sen pulled up the footage from the latest incident and watched it again, even though she already knew what she would see. A Korvathi handler, well-trained and experienced, walking into the barracks with food and speaking in calm, measured tones, and then Rikash dropping from the ceiling like a living blade and pinning the handler to the floor in less than 2 seconds flat, and the other 5 cubs circling and hissing while the handler went down, completely still, and waited for extraction. The problem was simple, and the problem was impossible. Every species that had tried to manage the cubs had failed for the same fundamental reason. The galaxy operated on predator and prey dynamics, and the Drash cubs could read those dynamics faster than any species alive. When the herbivore species handlers came in, they could not hide their fear, no matter how well trained they were, and the cubs smelled it and heard it in their heartbeats and saw it in the micro-movements of their bodies, and fear meant prey, and prey meant attack. When the predator species handlers came in, they stood tall and showed strength and met the cubs eye to eye, and the cubs read that as a challenge from a rival, and a challenge meant fight, and every fight ended with the handler in medical. There was no middle ground, no third option, no species in the galactic registry that could walk into that room and be read as something other than prey or rival. Or so Sen had believed until this morning, when a file had landed on her desk from the Human Integration Office. Humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, and Sen did not know much about them beyond the basics. They were persistence predators from a mid-tier death world. They were omnivores with an unsettling level of adaptability, and they had a diplomatic reputation for being friendly in a way that made other species deeply uncomfortable without being able to explain exactly why. The file belonged to Cadet Elias Morrow, and there was nothing special about it. Average combat scores, average academics, no disciplinary flags, but also no commendations. A perfectly unremarkable record that would have made Sen pass right over him if the Human Integration Office had not attached a note that read simply, "He is good with difficult creatures." Sen did not know what that meant, and she did not particularly care, because she was 3 days away from having to file a formal report to Union Command admitting that the Academy had failed to integrate the Drash cubs, and that report would collapse the Alliance and potentially send thousands of soldiers back to the border to die. She approved the transfer. Cadet Elias Morrow arrived at her office 2 hours later, and Sen's first thought was that someone had made a mistake, because the young man standing in front of her did not look like a solution to anything. He was average height for a human, lean but not muscular in any impressive way, with brown skin and dark hair cut short, and eyes that were calm in a way Sen found difficult to read. Not the calm of discipline or training, but something more natural. Something that seemed built into the way he carried himself, like a creature that had simply decided a long time ago that panic was not useful. She briefed him on the situation, and watched his face for the reactions she expected. Fear, or doubt, or at the very least concern. And she saw none of those things. He read the file quietly, and looked at the injury reports, and watched the security footage of Rikash dropping from the ceiling. And when he was done, he looked up at Sen and asked one question. "Can I do this my way?" Sen stared at him, and thought about the 11 injured handlers, and the 3 in medical tanks, and the psychologist who had quit, and the warship that Drash Command could send at any moment, and she realized that she had nothing left to lose. She said yes. He thanked her and left, and Sen watched him walk down the corridor toward the barracks wing with a growing certainty that she was about to watch another handler get torn apart on her security feeds. She pulled up the live camera footage and watched as Morrow stopped outside the barracks door and did something that made her sit forward in her chair. He removed his armor, then his protective vest, then his comm unit. All of it on the floor outside the door, and then he stood there in nothing but his basic uniform, with his hands relaxed at his sides, and no weapon, and no shield, and no protection of any kind. Sen reached for the emergency extraction button. Morrow opened the door and walked inside. The 6 cubs reacted instantly, spines flared, tails raised, bodies dropping into attack postures, hissing filling the room like a chorus of blades being drawn, and Rikash launched himself from his perch on the upper bunk, with his jaws wide open and his claws extended, and every line of his body saying that this small soft creature had made the last mistake of its life. And Elias Morrow looked at the incoming apex predator and did something that no handler had ever done before. He grinned. Not a nervous smile, not a grimace of fear, not the tight-lipped expression of someone bracing for pain, a full open grin that showed all of his teeth, bright and white and completely unafraid, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, and a small laugh escaped his throat as he sidestepped the lunge with an easy, casual motion, like he was dodging a ball thrown by a friend. Rikash landed behind him and spun around and froze, and the other 5 cubs froze with him. And for the first time since they had arrived at the academy, there was silence in the barracks. Sen stared at the screen and realized she was holding her breath. The human was still grinning, standing in a room full of apex predators who could kill him in a heartbeat. And he looked for all the galaxy, like someone who had just walked into a room full of old friends. He spoke, and his voice was warm and easy, and completely without fear. "Hey there, I am Eli, and I think we are going to get along just fine." The security footage from that first night became the most watched recording in the Academy's history. And the reason was simple. Nobody could explain what they were seeing. Commander Sen played it back 17 times and still could not understand it. When she called in her 2 best behavioral analysts, they watched it together in silence, and then looked at each other with the expression of scientists who had just seen something that should not be possible. The human had not submitted, and he had not dominated. In a galaxy where every social interaction between predator species fell into one of those 2 categories, what Elias Morrow had done was the equivalent of dividing by 0. The cubs did not know what to do with him. That first night after the lunge, Rikash had circled Eli for nearly 20 minutes, while the other 5 cubs watched from their perches around the room. And every few minutes, one of them would hiss or snap, or make a short charging feint toward him, and every single time Eli responded the same way. He looked at them with that easy grin, and either stepped aside or simply stood still. And his heart rate on the biomonitor never went above resting. That was the detail that fascinated the analysts most, because the Drosh cubs could hear heartbeats, and every handler before Eli had walked in with a heart that was pounding, no matter how calm their training made them look on the outside. And the cubs had heard the truth beneath the performance every single time. But Eli's heart was not performing. It was genuinely calm, and the cubs could hear it, and it confused them in a way that went deeper than behavior and reached down into the instincts that had been carved into their species across millions of years of evolution on one of the deadliest worlds in the galaxy. A calm heartbeat in the presence of apex predators meant one of two things. Either the creature was too stupid to understand the danger, or the creature was so dangerous itself that it did not consider them a threat. Eli was clearly not stupid, and so the cubs were left with the second option, and that second option made them careful in a way that nothing else had. Over the next several days, Sen watched through the cameras as Eli did things that no training manual in any species literature had ever suggested. On the second day he ignored them, not cruelly and not dismissively, but in the way that a large animal ignores smaller ones that are posturing nearby. He sat on his cot and read from a data pad and ate his meals and occasionally looked up and smiled at whichever cub was watching him, and then he went back to what he was doing, as if sharing a room with 6 deadly predators was the most ordinary thing in the world. The cubs did not know how to handle being ignored, because being ignored meant they were not a threat, and not being a threat was so far outside their understanding of themselves that it shook something loose inside them. On the third day, the smallest cub, a quick, nervous little creature that the Academy staff had been calling Subject 6, crept close to Eli while he was eating, and made a series of low, clicking sounds that the translator identified as a food request. Eli looked at the cub and then broke his ration bar in half and held out one piece. Every analyst watching the feed knew what this meant in Drash culture. Sharing food was a pack behavior, one of the most intimate social gestures their species had, reserved only for littermates and bonded family members. And for an outsider to offer it was either a profound insult or a profound invitation, depending on how it was received. Subject 6 took the food and ate it while sitting next to Eli, and something in the room shifted. On the fourth day, Eli introduced play. He took a length of cord from his kit bag and tied a knot at the end and dragged it across the floor, and the cubs stared at it the way scientists stare at an anomaly they cannot classify. And then Subject 6 pounced on it, and Eli laughed and pulled it away, and Subject 6 pounced again, and within 10 minutes 3 of the 6 cubs were chasing the cord across the barracks, while Eli sat in the middle grinning like he had invented joy itself. Commander Sen called a meeting of her senior staff and told them what she had seen, and the room went quiet in a way that told her nobody knew what to make of it. "He is playing with them," she said, and the words sounded absurd even as she spoke them. "Drask do not play," said Senior Analyst Kor, a veteran Korvathi behaviorist who had studied predator species for 30 years. "They do now," Sen replied. By the end of the first week, 5 of the 6 cubs had begun to orient toward Eli in a way that the analysts could only describe as gravitational. When he moved, they moved. When he sat, they gathered nearby. When he spoke, they listened with their heads tilted in that sharp, attentive way that Droshk reserved for sounds that mattered. 5 of 6. Rikash held out. The alpha cub maintained his distance and watched everything with eyes that burned like small, dark furnaces. And he did not chase the cord, and he did not take offered food, and he did not sleep anywhere near Eli's cot. And every day he tested the human with small, sharp provocations. A snap of teeth too close to his hand, a tail swipe near his legs, a low growl that vibrated the floor. Eli responded to each test the same way. He acknowledged it without fear, and then moved on, and his grin never wavered, and his heartbeat never changed. On the 9th day, Rikash escalated. Eli was crouching down adjusting the cot of one of the smaller cubs when Rikash moved, fast, faster than the cameras could track clearly, and his tail whipped across Eli's left arm, and the razor edge sliced through the uniform, sleeve, and into the skin beneath, and blood welled up, bright and red. The alarm triggered automatically, and Sen's hands slammed down on the extraction button, and the emergency team was moving before the blood had even reached the floor. But Eli raised his other hand in a stop gesture toward the camera, and his voice came through the audio feed, calm and clear. "Stand down. I am fine." He looked at the cut on his arm, and it was not shallow. The blood was running freely down to his wrist, and dripping from his fingers, and it must have hurt, because his jaw tightened for just a moment. Then he looked at Rikash. The alpha cub was frozen in place, watching with every sense he had, and his spines were raised, and his muscles were coiled, and he was waiting to see what the human would do, because this was the final test. Blood had been drawn, and every predator in the galaxy responded to their own blood with either rage or retreat. His kit bag with his uninjured hand, and pulled out a bandage wrap, and he began wrapping his arm with careful, steady movements, and the whole time he kept his eyes on Rikash. And he grinned, not a pained grimace, not a threat display, not the forced expression of someone pretending to be brave, a real, genuine grin, the kind that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. And he shook his head slightly, the way a parent shakes their head at a child who has knocked over a glass of water. "That was a good hit," he said quietly, and his voice held something that none of the translators could properly convey to the watching aliens. Warmth, mixed with respect, mixed with an unshakable patience that seemed to have no bottom. Rikash's spines slowly lowered. That night Sen sat in front of the security feed and watched as the barracks went dark, and the cubs settled into their sleeping positions. And she watched as Rikash, the alpha, the most aggressive and dangerous of all six, the cub who had put 3 handlers in medical, rose from his perch and crossed the room on silent feet, and curled his massive body on the floor, 3 feet from Eli's cot. Not on top of him, not touching him, not submitting, just close, the way a creature sleeps near something it has decided is safe. Sen leaned back in her chair and activated a comm channel to Senior Analyst Kor. "What is that?" she asked. Kor was quiet for a long time. "I do not have a word for it," he finally said, and his voice was troubled in a way that Sen had never heard from him before. "In 30 years of studying predator behavior across every known species, I have never seen a dynamic like this. It is not dominance, and it is not submission, and it is not alliance. And the closest word I can find is one from the human linguistic database that does not translate cleanly into any other known language." "What word?" Sen asked. "Trust," Kor said, and the word hung in the air between them, like something dangerous and new. 6 weeks after Elias Morrow walked into the barracks unarmed and grinning, the 6 Drash cubs attended their first formal class at the academy, and the hallway cleared in front of them like water parting around stones. But something was different about the way they moved. Before Eli, the cubs had moved through any space like a storm, chaotic and aggressive and reactive, snapping at anyone who came too close, and slamming their tails against walls, and hissing at every shadow that caught their attention. Now they walked in a loose group with Eli at the center, and their movements were calm and coordinated, and their spines were flat against their backs, and their eyes were alert but not hostile, and they looked for all the world like a pack that knew exactly where it was going and felt no need to prove anything to anyone along the way. The other cadets pressed themselves against the corridor walls and stared, and Eli nodded to them as he passed with the same steady, composed demeanor. Easy warmth he gave to everything, and behind him the smallest cub, who Eli had nicknamed Pip, mimicked the nod with a sharp bob of her head that looked more like a strike than a greeting, but was clearly meant with the same friendliness. That detail traveled through the academy faster than any official report could have. A Drash cub had tried to be friendly, and the galaxy was not built for that kind of information. In the weeks that followed, the changes in the cubs became impossible to ignore. Eli taught them patience through a game he called fishing, which involved a simulated holographic pond, and the challenge of sitting completely still until a light pattern appeared beneath the surface. And the cubs who had once been unable to hold position for more than 30 seconds learned to wait in absolute silence for minutes at a time. And the satisfaction they showed when they caught the light was something the behavioral analysts had never recorded in Drash Young before. Not the triumph of a kill, but the quieter, deeper pleasure of a challenge met through discipline. He taught them gentleness by introducing them to Cadet Miri, a young Pelori, one of the butterfly-like species whose wings were so delicate that a strong breeze could tear them, and whose bones were so light that a Drash cub could shatter every one of them with a casual bump. The cubs were terrified, not of Miri, of themselves, and what they could do to her if they were not careful. Eli stood beside Miri and showed the cubs how to modulate their movements, how to pull back the force that came so naturally to them, how to reach out with the tips of their claws retracted and touch something fragile without destroying it. And when Pip managed to brush her tail against Miri's outstretched wing without leaving so much as a mark, the little cub made a sound that the translators logged as a new vocalization with no existing Drashk equivalent. It was laughter. But the change that mattered most, the one that would eventually reshape galactic politics in ways that no one could yet see, was the names. Drash cubs did not receive true names until they survived their adult trial, a brutal rite of passage that killed roughly 1 in 5. And until that day they were referred to by birth order numbers or by the designation of their clutch. And this was considered proper and natural, and the way things had always been. Eli gave each of them a name in the second week, and he did it so casually that the analysts almost missed the significance. Rikash he kept as Rikash, because the cub had earned that name through sheer force of presence. But the others he renamed with sounds that felt good in his mouth and that the cubs could pronounce. Pip for the smallest, Kale for the quickest, Thorn for the one with the longest spines, Sage for the quiet thinker, and Brick for the one who was built like a small tank, and moved with all the grace of one. The cubs loved their names with a ferocity that startled everyone, and they used them constantly, introducing themselves to anyone who would listen, and correcting anyone who tried to use their old number designations, and the pride in their voices when they said their names was so sharp and bright that it cut through every cultural barrier in the building. Commander Sen watched all of this from her office and felt something she could not quite name, something between admiration and fear. Because what Eli was doing was working, but it was also something unprecedented, and unprecedented things made military commanders nervous. She was not the only one watching. Cadet Fasara, a Korvathi officer candidate who had been studying interspecies behavioral dynamics as her thesis focus, had been recording everything from the observation gallery since the first week, and her notes had grown from a standard academic file into something that was beginning to look like a warning. She presented her preliminary findings to Commander Sen in a private meeting, and the title of her report was Human Social Bonding, a Mechanism of Dominance Through Affection. He is not taming them, Thesara said, and her voice was measured, but her tail was twitching in the way that Korvathi tails twitched when their owners were deeply unsettled. Taming implies the suppression of natural behavior, and the replacement of it with obedience, and that is not what is happening here. The cubs are not less Drashk than they were before. They are arguably more Drashk, more confident, and more capable and more aware of their own strength. But they have added something to their identity that was not there before, and that something is loyalty to a specific individual. Loyalty is not unusual in predator species, Sen said. This kind is, Thesara replied. In every predator species we have studied, loyalty flows upward through dominance hierarchies. You obey the one who is stronger because the alternative is death or exile, and the moment a stronger individual appears, the hierarchy reshuffles and loyalty transfers. But the cubs are not loyal to Moro because he is stronger than them, because he is not, and they know he is not, and they could kill him at any time, and they all know this. Then why? Sen asked. Thesara was quiet for a moment. Because he makes them feel safe, and feeling safe is so rare and so valuable to a species that is born into a world where everything is trying to kill them, that once they have found it, they will do anything to keep it. And the human has become the source of that feeling, and I do not think he even realizes how powerful that is. Her report's conclusion would later be quoted at diplomatic summits across the galaxy, but on that day in Sen's office, it was just a sentence on a datapad that made the commander's scales go cold. Humans do not conquer through force. They conquer by making you love them, and you do not realize it has happened until you would die for them. Sen filed the report and marked it classified. But the political situation was already moving faster than classified reports could contain. Ambassador Drak Ven was a senior Drashk political officer stationed at the academy to oversee the Cubs' integration, and he had been watching the same footage as everyone else with very different eyes. The Cubs were supposed to remain Drashk, fierce and unbreakable and loyal only to the matriarch who had sent them. And the purpose of placing them at the academy was not education, but display, a way of showing the galaxy that Drashk young were superior to every other species' soldiers, and the Cubs' wildness and aggression had actually been serving that purpose even as it injured handlers. Now the Cubs were calm and coordinated, and they smiled, teeth the way the human did. And the expression on a Drashk face was deeply wrong in a way that Drak Ven felt in his bones, because a Drashk who bared its teeth was supposed to be killing, not greeting. He composed a message to the matriarch, encrypted and sent through channels that bypassed Academy oversight. The human is changing them, he wrote. They are still strong, but they are no longer ours, and if this continues, they will return to you as something you will not recognize, and I believe this must be stopped before it cannot be undone. 2 days later, Commander Sen received an encrypted transmission from Drashk space, and when she decoded it and read the contents, her blood went cold, in a way that even her reptilian biology rarely experienced. The Drashk matriarch Sakaar, mother of the 6 Cubs, veteran of 3 wars, the most feared individual in the hegemony, was sending a warship. She wanted her Cubs returned. Dealt with. Sen. Sen sat in her darkened office and looked at the message, and then looked at the security feed, where Eli was sitting cross-legged on the barracks floor, teaching Pip how to play a human hand-clapping game, and the little cub was laughing in that new sound that had no Drashk name, and Rikosh was watching from nearby, with his massive head resting on his folded arms, and his tail curled around his body in the posture the analysts had started calling content. Sen closed her eyes and began composing her own message to Union Command, and every word she typed felt like a step closer to something that could not be taken back. The Drashk heavy cruiser Fang of Rethka dropped out of hyperspace above Keldraxis like a predator breaking the surface of dark water, and every sensor array on the fortress moon screamed to life at once. The ship was enormous, a dark angular thing bristling with weapon arrays that the Academy's defensive systems could not match, and it hung in orbit with the patient stillness of something that did not need to move quickly, because nothing in its vicinity could stop it. Aboard the ship was Matriarch Sakaar, and she had not come to talk. Commander Sen received the communication from Union Command within the hour, and the orders were clear and delivered in the flat tone of officials who had already calculated the cost of resistance and decided it was too high. Hand over the human cadet, allow the matriarch to extract her cubs, and do nothing that could be interpreted as obstruction or hostility. The alliance between the Galactic Union and the Droshk hegemony was the only thing keeping the border stable, and one human cadet was not worth a war that would kill thousands. Sen understood the math, and she hated it. She went to the barracks personally to deliver the orders, and she found Eli sitting on the floor, while Sage and Pip practiced the hand-clapping game beside him, and Rikash lay nearby, like a scaled mountain, with his eyes half closed, and the room smelled like the ration bars they had shared for breakfast, and something else that Sen's translator could not identify, but that her instincts told her was safety. She told Eli what was happening, and she watched his face as the information landed. He did not panic, and he did not argue, and he did not make speeches about fairness, or justice, or rights, and instead he went very quiet for a long moment, and looked at the cubs around him. And Sen saw something pass through his eyes that she would later describe in her personal log as the most human thing she had ever witnessed. A fierce, protective sorrow that had no equivalent in any species she knew. "I am not leaving them," he said, and his voice was calm, but underneath the calm was something that Sen recognized from her decades of military service, the sound of a line being drawn that would not be moved. "That is not your decision, Cadet." "They are scared," Eli said, and he looked at her with those steady eyes that had faced down 6 apex predators without flinching. "The cubs can feel the tension in the station. They know something is wrong, and they do not understand what it is, and if I walk out of this room, they will think I abandoned them, and everything we have built will break, and you will have 6 terrified Drash cubs tearing this academy apart, and the matriarch will arrive to find her children worse than when she sent them." Sen stared at him and realized that he was not being defiant. He was being tactical, and his assessment was almost certainly, she left without giving a direct order for him to stand down, and she told herself it was because she needed to consult with her staff. But in truth, she knew she was giving him time, because some part of her that was older than her rank and her training understood that what was happening in that barracks was worth protecting. The cubs reacted to the tension exactly as Eli had predicted. They regressed, and their spines came up, and their hissing returned, and they clustered around Eli with a tight defensive formation that made the security team extremely nervous, and Rikash took a position outside the barracks door, and planted himself there like a wall of scales and rage, and refused to move for anyone. When the academy staff tried to approach, Rikash deployed his spines fully, and the venom glands at their tips began to glisten, and the staff retreated, and the standoff held. Matriarch Sekhar arrived at the academy in person on a shuttle that burned through the atmosphere like a falling star, and she brought with her 12 elite Droshk warriors in full battle array, each one standing over 8 feet tall, with armor that was grown from their own shed scales, and weapons that were extensions of their bodies. She walked through the academy corridors, and every living thing in her path flattened against the walls, or fled entirely. Because Sekhar was not just large, and not just armed, and not just powerful. She was the single most dangerous predator most of these species had ever been in the same building with, and her presence pressed against the instincts of every creature nearby, like a weight on the chest. She was 10 feet tall, and her scales were the deep black red of volcanic stone, and her eyes burned with an intelligence that was sharp enough to cut, and she moved with the fluid grace of something that had never in its entire life encountered a situation it could not dominate through force or will. Commander Sen in the Great Hall, and did not bother with diplomatic greetings. "Bring me the human," she said, and her voice resonated through the hall like a drumbeat in a cave. Eli came alone. He walked into the Great Hall the same way he had walked into the barracks on that first day. No armor, no weapons, no protection, just his basic uniform and his steady heartbeat, and his hands relaxed at his sides. Sekar looked down at him from her full height, and the difference between them was so extreme that several of the watching officers physically winced. She was a monster of evolution and warfare, and he was a small, soft creature who barely reached her chest. She bared her fangs in a full killing display, every tooth visible, venom dripping from the elongated canines, her spines flaring to their maximum spread. And it was a gesture that had made generals surrender and diplomats flee and hardened warriors drop to their knees. And he grinned. The silence in the great hall was so complete that Sen could hear her own blood moving through her veins. Sekar's eyes narrowed, and something flickered across her face that might have been the same confusion her cubs had felt on that first night, the same impossible contradiction of threat display and calm body and fearless heartbeat that did not fit any category her predator brain could process. "You bare your teeth at me, little creature," she said, and her voice was low and dangerous. "Where I come from, this means I am happy to meet you," Eli said, and his voice was respectful but not submissive, warm but not weak. "Your children do it now too. You should ask them what it means to them." The matriarch studied him the way a predator studies something it has never encountered before, and the calculation behind her eyes was vast and cold, and operating on levels that went far beyond this single moment. "Bring my cubs," she said. Eli nodded and went to the door, and when he opened it, the 6 cubs were already there, because of course they were. They had followed him the moment he left the barracks, and Rikosh had been standing just outside the hall, with his spines raised and his body ready to breach the door at the first sound of distress. They walked in, and what happened next broke the matriarch's composure in a way that nothing had broken it in decades. The cubs were calm. They entered the great hall in their loose coordinated formation, with Eli at the center, and they did not cower at the sight of their mother, and they did not drop into the submission posture that Droshk young were expected to perform before a matriarch, and they did not flinch at the sight of the 12 warriors flanking her. They were confident without arrogance, alert without anxiety, strong without the desperate aggressive edge that had defined them since birth. Rikosh stepped forward. The alpha, the largest, the one who had put 3 handlers in medical, and who had drawn Eli's blood, and who had been the last to yield, and he walked toward his mother, this towering figure of absolute authority, and he looked her in the eyes. He bared his teeth, not in aggression, not in submission, not in any gesture that existed in the Droshk behavioral catalog. He bared them the way Eli did, with warmth and confidence in something that the translators could only render as joy. And he said his name, not his clutch designation, not his birth number, but the name that Eli had given him and that he had made his own. "I am Rikosh," he said, and his voice was clear and proud. Sekar stared at her son, and then looked at each of her other cubs one by one, and she saw in them something she had not expected to see. Not weakness, not corruption, not the softening that Drak Ven had warned her about, but a kind of strength she had never encountered. Strength that did not need to prove itself through violence, because it was rooted in something deeper. She turned to Eli, and the great hall held its breath. "What are you?" she asked, and for the first time her voice held something other than authority. It held genuine curiosity, the sound of a mind encountering something it could not immediately classify. Eli's grin did not waver. "Just a human, matriarch." Sekar studied him for a long, long moment, and the calculations behind her eyes shifted and recalculated and shifted again, and the 12 warriors at her back stood perfectly still, because they could feel the weight of the decision their matriarch was making. Then, slowly and deliberately, with the full awareness of what the gesture meant and what it would signify to everyone watching, the most feared predator in the sector pulled back her lips and bared her teeth. Not in threat. She was smiling. And across the great hall, 6 cubs and 1 human grinned back at her. The decision Matriarch Sekar made in the Great Hall that day sent shockwaves through the diplomatic channels of 47 species. And the message she delivered to the stunned Galactic Union Council was played and replayed in government chambers, from one end of known space to the other. "My cubs were weapons," she said, standing before the council with her full height and her full presence and the absolute authority of a leader who had never once in her life needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. This human made them warriors. There is a difference, and I did not understand it until now. She did not take her cubs home. Instead, she proposed something unprecedented. The cubs would remain at the academy under Eli's guidance as the founding members of a new joint species cohort, a unit where young predator species would train alongside humans in a program designed not to suppress their natures, but to build upon them. Because they did not have a choice. When the most powerful matriarch in the Drashk hegemony made a request, it was understood by everyone present that the word request was being used loosely. Ambassador Drak Ven watched all of this from his quarters with a cold fury that had been building for weeks, and he understood with perfect clarity that the world he had known was ending, and that the human was the reason. He had served the old ways his entire career, the ways that valued strength measured in kills, and loyalty measured in obedience, and worth measured in the fear you could put into the eyes of those beneath you. And the thing the human had built was a direct threat to every one of those pillars. He could not challenge the matriarch directly because that was suicide. But he could create a situation that would prove the human's methods were fragile, that the cubs were still dangerous, that the softness Eli had introduced would shatter under real pressure, leave behind nothing but the same wild, uncontrollable creatures they had always been. The Academy's Xenobiology wing contained holding pens for a variety of combat training organisms, and the most dangerous among them were 3 Velkhounds, massive eyeless predatory beasts that hunted by vibration and heat signature, and that were used in advanced combat scenarios because they were relentless and nearly impossible to redirect once they had locked on to prey. Drak Ven arranged for the containment system in Training Wing 7 to fail during a routine exercise session, and he timed it for the exact hour when the joint species cohort would be using the adjacent corridor. The breach alarm went off at 1400 hours. Eli was walking with his cubs and a mixed group of cadets, 2 Korvathi, 3 Thessians, a Pelori named Miri whose delicate wings caught the light as she moved, and a handful of others from species that had never shared space with Drashk before and were still getting used to the experience. The alarm changed everything in an instant. Emergency bulkheads slammed down and sealed the corridor into a closed section, and the lights shifted to the deep amber of a containment breach. And through the heavy doors at the far end came a sound that every cadet recognized from combat training, the low, grinding vocalization of a Velkhound on the hunt. 3 of them. The non-predator cadets panicked immediately, and Eli could not blame them, because 3 Velkhounds in an enclosed space was a scenario that even advanced combat units struggled with. And these were junior cadets caught without weapons or armor in a corridor that had just become a cage. Miri's wings were vibrating with terror so intense that the motion was generating a heat signature that would draw the Velkhounds straight to her. And the Thessian cadets had frozen in the biological paralysis response of their species, and the Korvathi were backing against the walls with their tails rigid. The cubs' spines came up, and their old instincts surged, the wild, aggressive response that had ruled them before Eli, the urge to scatter and attack individually and fight for their own survival without regard for anyone else. Eli saw it happening, and he moved. He stepped to the center of the group, and he looked at his cubs, all 6 of them, spines up and muscles coiled, and eyes burning with the ancient fire of their species. And he grinned. Not the grin of someone pretending to be calm, not the performance of bravery for the benefit of others, but the real and genuine expression of a human who was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. "All right, Pack," he said, and his voice was steady and warm, and carried through the amber-lit corridor like a hand reaching out in the dark. "Time to work." The cubs responded, and what happened next was recorded by every security camera in the wing, and would later be studied at military academies across the galaxy as the defining example of what the Joint Species Cohort could produce. Rickash took point, not because Eli ordered him to, but because that was his role, the Alpha, the first into danger, and he positioned himself between the sealed door and the rest of the group, with his massive body creating a living wall of armored scales. Kale and Thorn flanked the vulnerable cadets on either side, with their spines angled outward in defensive formation, and Sage moved to the rear to cover the back approach, and Pip and Brick positioned themselves around Miri specifically because they understood something that no one had taught them directly, that the smallest and most fragile member of the group was the one who needed the most protection. They did not do this because they were following a military protocol. They did it because they were a pack, and this is what packs did. Center had taught them that strength was not measured by what you could destroy, but by what you could protect. The first Velkhound came through the door at full speed, a massive eyeless thing with jaws that could crush starship plating, and limbs that moved with a terrible mechanical precision, and it locked onto the heat cluster of the group and charged. Rickash met it head-on, and the impact shook the corridor, and the two predators grappled in a blur of scales and claws and grinding teeth, and Rickash held his ground with the kind of controlled ferocity that was nothing like the wild, flailing aggression of his early days at the academy. Every movement was measured and deliberate, and aimed at containing rather than killing. The second Velkhound came from the side corridor and moved straight toward the cluster of terrified cadets, drawn by Miri's heat signature, and it was fast enough that none of the cubs on the flank could intercept it in time. Into its path. He had no weapon, and no armor, and no natural defenses that would mean anything against a creature that could tear through metal, and he put himself between the Velkhound and the cadets, with nothing but his body and his will and that infuriating grin. The Velkhound struck him across the chest and sent him spinning into the wall, and the sound his body made against the metal was loud enough that every cub in the corridor heard it, and the blood that appeared on his uniform was bright red against the gray fabric. Eli hit the wall and slid down, and his vision blurred, and for a moment the pain was everything, and then he pushed himself back up to one knee, and he grinned through the blood on his face, because he was human, and humans did not stay down. The cubs saw their human bleeding. What followed was later described by senior analyst Core as the most remarkable display of coordinated predator behavior he had ever witnessed in any species. The cubs did not lose control. They found it. Kale hit the second Velkhound from the left at exactly the same moment Thorn hit it from the right, and they drove it away from the cadets and pinned it against the wall with a precision that would have impressed any combat instructor. And when it thrashed, they adjusted and held, and when it snapped, they evaded and re-engaged, and they did not kill it, because Eli had taught them the difference between stopping a threat and destroying one. Brick and Pip intercepted the third Velkhound before it even reached the main corridor, and the little cub, who had once been too nervous to take food from a stranger's hand, fought with a focused intensity that was breathtaking, and Brick used his massive frame to drive the creature back, step by step, while Pip darted around it and disabled its sensory organs with precise strikes to the vibration receptors along its jaw. Within 4 minutes, all 3 Velkhounds were subdued and contained, alive and neutralized, pinned by cubs who stood over them with heaving sides and raised spines, and the fierce, bright pride of young warriors who had faced their first real battle and won it the right way. Eli was on his feet by then, one arm pressed against the wound on his chest, and blood still running between his fingers, and he looked at his cubs, and his grin was the brightest thing in the amber-lit corridor. "Good pack," he said, and his voice was rough with pain, but warm with a pride that ran deeper than words. "That is what strength looks like." Drakven's sabotage was uncovered within the day. The containment failure was too convenient and too well-timed, and the digital trail led straight to his personal terminal. And when Matriarch Sakar's own security agents came for him, the ambassador learned what it meant to threaten a matriarch's cubs. And they're human. The months that followed changed the shape of the galaxy in ways that were slow and quiet and irreversible. The joint species cohort grew. Other predator species sent their young, first the Kreloks, and then the Vashan, and then even the notoriously isolated Threk, who had not participated in a joint program with any other species in living memory. And each new group of wild and terrified and dangerous young predators arrived to find a human who grinned at them without fear, and cubs of other species who had learned to smile back. Eli was promoted to a rank that did not exist before him, cohort leader, a position that the Academy created specifically because there was no existing title that described what he did. And in the Droshk records, his designation was entered in a term that translated roughly as the one who grins. Cadet Thesara completed her thesis, and it was published across every academic and military network in the Union, and the final paragraph was quoted so often that it became something close to scripture in the halls of galactic diplomacy. Do not pity the species that bares its teeth in joy. Do not underestimate the creature that plays with apex predators and calls them family. The humans do not conquer worlds, they simply adopt them. And by the time you realize you have been adopted, you will fight to the death to stay. On a quiet evening in the cohort common room, Eli sat in a worn chair with a datapad on his knee and a cup of something warm in his hand. And around him, the room was full of life. Cubs and cadets of a dozen species sprawled on every surface, studying and arguing, and playing the clapping game that Pip had taught to everyone who would learn it. And Rikash, now nearly 7 feet tall, and still growing, with scales that had darkened to the deep black red of his mother's, and eyes that held a fierce intelligence that made senior officers nervous, was curled up beside Eli's chair, with his massive tail draped across the human's lap, like a house cat who did not realize it. Weighed 300 pounds. The door opened. Commander Sen walked in, and behind her were 4 new arrivals. Young predators from a species Eli did not immediately recognize, feral and snarling and terrified, with quills raised and teeth bared, and every line of their small bodies screaming that the universe was a dangerous place, and they would fight every inch of it alone. Sen looked at Eli with an expression that had become familiar over the months, half exasperation and half something warmer that she would never admit to publicly. 4 more, she said. They injured 2 handlers on the transport ship and bit the docking officer. The diplomatic team says they are unmanageable. Eli looked at the new arrivals, and the new arrivals looked back at him with wild, frightened eyes that saw a soft, small creature and could not understand why it was not afraid of them. He set down his datapad and his cup, and Rikash lifted his head and regarded them. Newcomers with the calm, steady gaze of an alpha, who remembered what it was like to be exactly where they were standing. Eli stood up. He walked toward the snarling, terrified children, and the common room went quiet behind him, and every cub and cadet in the room watched, because they had all been here. They had all stood where these newcomers were standing. They had all been wild and scared and certain that the universe held nothing but threats. He stopped a few paces away and looked at them. 4 small creatures bristling with quills and fear, and the desperate aggression of young things who had never known anything else. And Eli Morrow, cohort leader, the one who grins, the small, soft human who had walked unarmed into a room full of apex predators and changed the shape of the galaxy with nothing but patience and warmth and an unshakable refusal to be afraid, did the only thing he had ever known how to do.